All right, welcome everybody to our final edition of the study of the Gospel of Mark for the year 2020. And today we're going to finish up the last part of the 10th chapter of Mark's Gospel. And after the first of 2021, we'll get back and pick up with the 11th chapter. If you'd like to be a part of our Zoom discussion Wednesday night at 7 p.m., either use the link you've already used, or you can email us and we'll send you that link, that Zoom link for Wednesday night discussion. So we've got 7 verses in front of us, and yet it has an interesting outline to it. Just generally, this is a story of a blind person named Bartimaeus and his healing, but there's a lot more to it than that. So it begins with a setting in verse 46, a very curious setting. So we'll look at that for a moment. But then the action begins when Bartimaeus speaks and the crowd responds. So there's a little back and forth between Bartimaeus and the crowd. Now, I have BB listed for Bartimaeus. This is just my own little thing here. You can either read that as blind Bartimaeus, or you can read it as Bartimaeus, Bartimaeus. And I'll tell you why you can read it that way in a few minutes. After the interaction with the crowd, then there's a really curious thing in verse 49 and 50 of a call and a response. One that can be rather instructive for us, I think. And then there's a conversation between Jesus and Bartimaeus, which is powerful. And then a great conclusion that really brings to an end probably the second major section of Mark's story, because in the very next story, they're going to be entering into Jerusalem. So, without any further ado, let's just jump into it. This is the New Revised Standard Version translation. They came to Jericho, and as he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he's calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. And this ends the reading of this story. So let's circle back now and take it verse by verse, and we'll begin with my translation, which is never better than anybody else's, but does uncover some of the translation challenges for us. And here we go. We begin with, "And they enter into Jericho. And as he was going out from Jericho." Notice how this first verse makes the setting just outside of Jericho. But it doesn't say they walked up and just outside of Jericho. They go into Jericho, and then they come out of Jericho, and now they encounter Bartimaeus, the blind man. Nothing about what happens in Jericho seems to matter, but the fact that it is Jericho does seem to matter to Mark. You might remember a couple of weeks ago, we had a story that I thought was probably not authentically a Markan story, because it just had a really nebulous entry. It was a change of scenery, but it didn't really tell us anything. Unlike this one, where there's no doubt for us now where we are. We're at Jericho. Ched Meyer says Jericho, he refers to it like a suburb of Jerusalem. It's a little farther away than most suburbs would be, and it's about a day's journey. But it was understood, he argues, as one of those places where you would go and you could possibly stay if you're going to Jerusalem. because it's just a good day's journey from Jerusalem. And as such, he argued, it would be filled with people who had both the piety and the means to help a beggar. So the fact that now we're going to run into a blind beggar who is poor doesn't necessarily speak well for the people going in and out of Jericho. Here we are outside the walls of Jericho. Someone's yelling out. The last time we heard someone yell out outside the walls of Jericho, the walls came a-tumbling down. But I, for the life of me, don't see much relationship between that story of Joshua and the Battle of Jericho in the Old Testament and this story. But we are almost at Jerusalem. And that's what makes this a very compelling story. And we are almost in the last week of Jesus' life. So that's what makes this a very compelling story. So the rest of verse 46 then. They exited Jericho and his disciples and the large crowd. The son of Timaeus, blind beggar Bartimaeus, was sitting along the road. So the name Bartimaeus, just pay attention to that. It's two parts. The prefix is bar, which in Aramaic means son of. It would be like MacDonald or something like that in other countries, showing family. Timaeus is a word that we've run across before, and it's in the nominal form there. And so to say that he is Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, is really a repetition. He's Bartimaeus, Bartimaeus. That's why I use BB as the initials there, because he's identified this way. Now, why would Mark identify someone as son of Timaeus, son of Timaeus? One possibility might be that it's not really a name. That's not necessarily referring to a person. It's more of a type. Kind of like the name Barabbas in the crucifixion stories. That literally means son of a father. It's not really a proper name that anybody would have because there's nothing to it. It means son of a father. It just means this is a male of some sort. So in fact, Mark may be telling a story of Bartimaeus, not to designate an actual person, but to designate people in general. Because the word Timaeus is curious. It can mean one of two things. It can mean son of honor, or it can mean son of shame. So there's a great blog post by Garrett Hughes that says it could be, this is either the honored one or the impure one, the son of fame or the son of shame. And those are two very, very different options, right? So it's odd to find a word that can mean almost total opposites like that. Dick Allen informed me when I pointed this out about another word a couple of weeks ago that that's called a contronym, a word that can mean two opposite things at once. And we're going to see the verbal form of this word in verse 48, and it too can mean two opposite things. So you've got an odd name, an ambiguous name. It can be son of honor, son of shame, or it could be Bartimaeus, son of honor, or Bartimaeus, son of shame. It's just kind of interesting how it's set up. And so the word blind, the word beggar, the word Bartimaeus, the word son, they're all in the nominative form. So this is just a long kind of description of this single individual, Bartimaeus, sitting on the side of the road. And he's described as blind beggar Bartimaeus. Okay? Blind, that will figure prominently in the story. Beggar. So being blind, he doesn't have any means of income, one would imagine. And as a beggar, he would sit on the side of the road, spread out his cloak, and live off of alms of others. Probably then, if this is an actual figure that was set up outside of Jericho, it would have been a relatively familiar sight for people going in and out of Jericho. So Jesus goes in with the disciples, a large crowd, they come out, and there on the side of the road is Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus. Verse 47, and having heard that Jesus is the Nazarene, he began to cry out and to say, Son of David, Jesus, have mercy on me. Or, as I translate it, Son of David, Jesus, mercy me. All right, let's look at this for a moment. The phrase Jesus, the Nazarene, both of those are in the nominative form. It can be translated various ways. It could say, having heard that Jesus, the Nazarene, is. It could be having heard that Jesus is the Nazarene. It could be having heard that it would be an implied pronoun. It is Jesus the Nazarene. The thing is, when you have the verb to be, you can have a nominative word that takes the form of the predicate, and but it's always a judgment call. So the New Revised Standard Version had this, having heard that it is Jesus the Nazarene. I have it saying, having heard that Jesus is the Nazarene. And the reason I say that is because of how Bartimaeus responds to that. We'll get to that in just a moment. So, first he cries out. This is a word we've seen before. It's an onomatopoeia, croxo. It's supposed to sound like a squawking or something like that. I typically translated he squawked. Back when I translated this text earlier, I just wasn't on that page yet. But this is the same word that we've seen in that respect. And he cries out, mercy me. It is true that Marvin Gaye may be the only translator of the New Testament who translates this literally. Ah, mercy, mercy me. Because that's exactly what it says. Mercy me. Mercy is a verb. And we don't use it as a verb in the English language. And so typically an English translation would change it to have mercy on me. But the actual literal Greek there, it says mercy me. Mercy is a verb. It's something that you do to somebody. And then we want to note that Bartimaeus refers to Jesus as Son of David. Son of David. So now we have a title for Jesus, the very first time we've seen it in Mark's Gospel. And it may be the only time we see it in Mark's Gospel. There is, in the very next story, which I think is a very related story, is a story we often call the story of the triumphal entry of Jesus. You know that the crowd will go, they will throw their cloaks on the ground, and they will say, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is our ancestor David, whose coming reign is here, something like that. Sometimes translations make that blessed is the Son of David, but that would be a weird translation in Mark's Gospel. So this is the first time Jesus is referred to with regard to David and the kingship of David. So we don't know if Bartimaeus is right or not. He may be calling Jesus Son of David as a way of protesting against those who told him that Jesus the Nazarene is coming. It may be that Bartimaeus, in his blindness, sees that there's more to Jesus than just someone who is born and bred in Nazareth. We remember that Jesus' relationship with his hometown Nazareth is not a very positive one. And it could be that Bartimaeus is actually protesting by calling Jesus something much more honorable than Son of Nazareth, Nazarene, but rather calls him Son of David. It could be that Bartimaeus, as a type, is connecting with Jesus as a type. Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, connecting with Jesus, son of David. It's very curious that of all places, this is where this title pops up for the very first and probably the only time. There is an argument in the 12th chapter where Jesus, it seems, distances himself from the title Son of David. So we'll have to wait till we get to the 12th chapter and look at that more closely. But for now, let's just notice this. Bartimaeus is the first person to make this claim about Jesus. We don't have a genealogy in Mark's gospel that would connect Jesus back to the throne of David. We haven't really heard a bunch of quotes from Isaiah or any of the Psalms that would, or 2 Samuel that would argue that Jesus is going to fulfill the stump of Jesse or anything like that. None of that's happening in Mark's gospel. So this is the first time Jesus has been directly connected to David, and Bartimaeus may or may not be right. Either way, having heard that Jesus is the Nazarene, he began to cry out, saying, "Son of David, Jesus, mercy me." Verse 48. And many people rebuked to him in order that he might be silent. But the more loudly he was crying, "Son of David, mercy me." Okay, so I told you in verse 48 we're going to run into another word that's a contronym that can mean two different opposite things, right? And it's this word rebuked. Timao. Notice that the root of that word timao is the same root as the name timaeus. This is the verbal form. Timaeus is the nominal form of the same word. And like the name timaeus, which can either be honor or shame, the word timao can either be rebuke or to honor somebody. Almost in every case, it ends up being a reference to rebuking somebody, to silencing somebody. So the very first thing that happens to Bartimaeus in this story is an anti-healing. That in addition to being blind, the crowd is now trying to make him mute and to silence him. I expect that there's something at stake for the crowd here. Something a little more than a sense of, impropriety, like this loud nuisance on the side of the road really ought to keep it down. Because look, they're outside. They're not in a cathedral. They're not in a place where some little screaming beggar over here necessarily needs to make a difference. Some people say that the crowd's resistance to Bartimaeus is part of the story because this story parallels an earlier story that we read of the woman who, after bleeding for 12 years and after undergoing many procedures and only getting worse and worse, fights a crowd in order to come because she believes that if she can just grab Jesus' garment, she will be healed. And her biggest challenge in getting to Jesus and getting that healing for herself is the crowd. And so likewise in this story, you got Bartimaeus over there raising his voice, and his biggest problem is the crowd, or many people who rebuke him in order to make him be silent. Time and time again, when we've seen this word epitimao, it has meant to rebuke. We saw it when Jesus gave his first disclosure of going to Jerusalem, and Peter rebuked him. And then, of course, Jesus in turn rebuked Peter. So, you've got the beggar crying out. You've got the crowd rebuking him. And then what happens? He responds by crying out all the louder, "Son of David, mercy me." We saw the same thing happen in an early story when Jesus healed a stammering deaf man. And then after the healing, Jesus ordered them, those who had witnessed it, not to tell anyone. But the more he ordered him, the more zealously they proclaimed it. Likewise here, the crowd is telling Bartimaeus to hold it down, and the more they try to silence him, the more tenacity he shows. Again, very much like the woman who had to work through the crowd to grab a hold of Jesus' garment. Bartimaeus is not being stopped by the crowd. Jesus is being stopped. Having stopped, Jesus said, "Call him." And they called the blind man while saying to him, "Take courage, rise, he's calling you." So, it's curious here. Who is the they who call the blind man and say these words, "Take courage, rise, he's calling you"? Are they the ones who were just rebuking him? If they are, that's just a real turnaround, isn't it? For one moment, they're trying to get this guy to be quiet, and now they're telling him, come on, he's waiting for you. They've really had a change of heart in some respects. And the first thing they say to him is, "Take courage." This is a verb that only appears in the imperative in the Gospels. And it's the same thing that Jesus said when he came walking on the water to the disciples who were in a boat in a tempest. And his words were, "Take courage, do not fear, it is I." We've seen throughout Mark's Gospel so far that some of the responses to Jesus is either to respond with fear or to take courage. Take courage. That's a great phrase to describe the woman who fights the crowd and grabs Jesus' garment. It's a great phrase to describe a Syrophoenician woman who is at first rebuffed by Jesus and kind of hangs in there and argues Jesus down until her daughter is healed. And now it's something for Bartimaeus. Take courage. Have faith. Trust. He's calling you. And then I want to look at the dynamic here, okay? Jesus stops and says to them, whoever they are, "Call him." And they call him and say, "He is calling you." Okay? Do you like my gestures there? Jesus tells them to call him. They call him, saying, "He is calling you." And in some respects, that little triangular pattern right there is a marvelous way of thinking about evangelism, where you have been called to go out and call others. But you don't call them in your own name, you call them in the name of Christ. So that's what it means to represent the name of Christ. It is for you to become the one who conveys that message. He is calling you. And one reason many of us back off of evangelism is because we feel like, we despise the way that people go about doing evangelism. But we almost feel like it makes us look like we're all high and mighty and telling people, this is what you ought to do. But we're not really telling people, this is what you ought to do. What we're doing is we're conveying a message. He is calling you. And if you are convicted with the sense that Christ is calling those who are lost or hurt or blind or seeking help, then your job of evangelism is to convey that message. He's calling you. Take courage. You can do this. That's a marvelous way, I think, of thinking about evangelism. And then verse 50. This is fun. Then having thrown off his cloak, having leaped up, he came to Jesus. This starts with two aorist participles, and then it's got the verb that he came to Jesus. So what happens before he comes to Jesus? First of all, having thrown off his cloak. I think for a long time, I didn't see much significance in this phrase. And I have a blog, Left Behind and Loving It. And on that blog, I put translations of Scripture, and I just put up that I just really didn't see what the significance of that was. And suddenly, some of the folks who read that blog every week started responding, and I learned a lot. It's great, the way we can learn together like that. So one of the comments was, if this beggar is homeless, think about the role that cloak plays. You have walls that block the wind and the night and the creepy crawling howlers at night and everything from coming to you. But this man has only a cloak. to wrap himself against the elements or against the critters, right? So that cloak might be the closest thing he has to a house or a bed or any kind of protective wall. Chad Myers points out, and others have said it as well, that one of the ways that beggars would beg is that they would spread out their cloak, and that's what you would drop money on. I mean, if this guy can't see, he spreads out his cloak, people leave money, and in the end, he wraps it up, and then he's able to gather the money in the middle. So this might be one of, Chet Myers calls it, one of the tools of the trade. Someone even suggested that to be a beggar, you had to have an approved cloak to put out. I don't know about that. But it does strike me as, if this is his tool of the trade, then for him to toss aside the cloak to follow Jesus is not very different from the first call story where the fishers lay aside their nets and follow Jesus. It might be a different kind of livelihood, and it might be a begging rather than an artisan livelihood. But the idea that he would lay aside his tool in order to follow Jesus is really what discipleship is supposed to look like. And don't forget that in the very next story, we're going to hear another reference to cloaks, when people take their cloaks and throw them out on the street for Jesus to ride into Jerusalem. There are several interesting parallels between this story and that one, and tossing the cloak is one of them. And then the other participle is leaping up. He comes to Jesus, okay? And to me, this is a rhetorical way of paralleling this story with the story of the rich man that we read a couple of weeks ago. Remember, that story began with the rich man running to Jesus and kneeling before him and asking, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" Remember that? So there's, again, that kind of urgency sort of feel to running up to Jesus. And here we have Bartimaeus throwing off his cloak, leaping up, and coming to Jesus in response to Jesus' call. And here's what happens. In answering him, Jesus said, so Jesus is answering that call he's been hearing earlier. Regardless of the crowd's attempt to try to silence Bartimaeus, Jesus is now answering that call. Answering him, Jesus says, "What do you will that I should do for you?" Then the blind man said to him, "Rabbouni, that I may see." So this question, what do you will that I should do for you? We've seen this exact verbiage before in the previous chapter. Previously in this chapter, I'm sorry, when Jesus gave the third disclosure about going to Jerusalem to die. And you recall that in response, James and John came to Jesus and said, "Teacher, please grant us whatever we ask of you." And Jesus' response was exactly these words, "What do you will that I should do for you?" Now, you might remember that what they wanted Jesus to do was, when he entered his glory, to have them on the right and on the left. So they asked something that Jesus explicitly says is not mine to give. Here, he asked a question to Bartimaeus, "What do you will that I should do for you?" And he's going to grant it. And then Bartimaeus calls him Rabbouni. Now, in the New Revised Standard Version, we heard "my teacher." So there's the word rabbi, which is a little bit common in the gospel stories. And then you've got this word Rabbouni, which is obviously a version of that title. We're told that it's a little more of an intimate way, like "my teacher," as opposed to "teacher." I don't know if that's necessarily true. Sometimes I feel like these lexicons are making things up, so they make good and fast sense to us. The only other time we run into this title, Rabbouni, is not in Mark's Gospel. It's in John's Gospel, and it's the story of the resurrection, when Martha is there, and first she doesn't see Jesus through her veil of tears, but Mary is there. I'm sorry, Mary Magdalene, and Jesus calls her Mary, and then suddenly she sees who it is and says, Rabbouni. That's the only other time we hear it. And because of that story, it strikes us as a very endearing term. Like, this is somebody who one holds in the highest regard, not just a title, as it were, of respect. He answered, Rabbouni, that I may see. You might remember that when we read this in the New Revised Standard Version, it says that I may see again. Now the word again, palin, is not in this verse. So why would the New Revised Standard Version translate it that way? It could be because the word see, there are many variations of this word. The root is the word blepo, which can be to see or to look. And this version of the word blepo has a prefix, ana blepo, which means to look up. And literally means to look up. Ana would be the prefix for up. I would suspect that what the New Revised Standard Version is doing, and believe me, they know this stuff much better than I do, is that they are reading that prefix not simply as to look up, but to look again, to see again. And because later in verse 52, instead of saying that Bartimaeus gets his sight, they say he regains his sight. So in many respects, they're seeing this as Bartimaeus is not someone who's blind from birth, but someone who has been blinded along the way. And so he's asking to regain his sight as opposed to simply receive his sight. Small matter, but it's kind of interesting that they translate it that way. And then verse 52, the last verse of our study for today. Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you whole." And immediately he was seeing and followed him on the road. There's a lot to unpack here, okay? Jesus says go, and instead of going, he followed. This is lovely disobedience here. Happens several times. And Bartimaeus becomes a disciple, because the word to follow, akalutheo, is a word that is used in call stories. Come, follow me. Anyone who wants to be my disciple, let them follow behind me. Following Jesus is a means of discipleship. So this story begins with Bartimaeus, either the son of honor or son of shame, being a blind beggar, and ends with Bartimaeus as a disciple, following Jesus on the road. And look at this phrase. Look at this phrase. This is key here, right? He says, go, your faith has made you whole. Does that sound familiar to you? Do you recall where we've heard Jesus say that before? It's a story that I've already made allusion to a couple of times in this presentation, because I think it's very much a parallel story to this one. And it's the woman with courageous faith who had been bleeding for 12 years, who fights the crowd with the conviction that if I can only grab his garment, I will be made well, made whole. And she grabs his garment. You recall that? And Jesus feels some healing power going out of him, and he turns around in this crowd and says, who touched me? Who grabbed me? And the disciples, say, what a silly question, Jesus. There's so many people piled around you, and you're asking who grabbed me. And Jesus ignores that, keeps looking, and this woman, knowing that a healing had taken place in her body, comes to Jesus and tells him the whole story. The whole story. After which Jesus looks at her and says, daughter, your faith has made you whole. Go in peace. It's a really, really beautiful story. And so there are two things I want you to hear about this. This is again, making a parallel to that story, blind Bartimaeus is like this woman with courageous faith. And they both fight the crowds, and they both have faith. And Jesus attributes both of them, their healings, to their faith. So they are leaning in to this reign of God at hand that Jesus has been proclaiming. And Jesus rewards that and applauds that in many ways. Your faith has made you whole. And again, the phrase made you whole, this is that word sozo, which can mean to save. So remember last week in our presentation, we had the rich man who comes to Jesus asking, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus tells him, they go through the law, and then Jesus says, sell everything you have, come follow me. And the man doesn't. He goes away sorrowful, right? His face falls. He walks away in despair. And Jesus says how hard it is for anyone with wealth to enter the reign of God. And the disciples ask, well, who then can be saved? And that's a troubling question, because all of us have money. And we're wondering, who then can be saved? But remember that question, who then can be saved, it's the same word here, sozo. And I asked in our discussion last week, how many of you know of someone who can be made whole, who can be saved according to Mark? And one person we were able to identify was this woman with great faith, because Jesus looked to her and said, your faith has saved you. If that's the language we want to use, if that's how we want to translate sozo, is save, then Jesus says to her, your faith has saved you. And Jesus says to Bartimaeus, your faith has saved you. I think it's better to translate sozo in a more holistic fashion every time we run across it, to where here the question, the claim is, your faith has made you whole. So you got to ask then, what is faith? Is it believing in a bunch of propositions, or is it fighting through the crowd, begging Jesus for what you need? Is it fighting through the doubts? Is it fighting through the things that lie between us and Jesus in order to make clear what we need? So far we've got a woman, a desperate woman, and a blind beggar who have faith, and they demonstrate that faith through their tenacity. And then of course it ends by saying, and Bartimaeus followed him on the road. So the other parallel story, I've been referencing many times the parallel between Jesus and the woman with courageous faith who had been bleeding for 12 years. I think there's another contrast story, and that's between Bartimaeus, the blind beggar, and the rich man, both of whom come to Jesus in very enthusiastic ways. And with the rich man, he's not ready to throw his cloak aside and follow Jesus. So he goes away sorrowful. Bartimaeus throws off the only thing he's got left and comes to Jesus. And with that faith, his faith has made him whole. And he follows Jesus. It's a real interesting instance of the first becoming the last, and the last becoming the first. So we want to hold two things together. Number one, we want to hold the story of Bartimaeus side by side with the story of the woman with courageous faith, because they are kind of the archetypes of discipleship. Not the disciples, they are the archetypes of discipleship in Mark's gospel. The disciples start out that way, they leave their nets and they follow, and bless their hearts, they're still there. But man alive, are they really struggling with having faith? And they give into fear and being not courageous over and over again. But so far we've got these two real archetypes of discipleship, in that their faith gives them a persistence, and their faith has made them whole. And then I want you also to think of this story in the contrast terms with the rich man, because it would seem like the rich man, who is a good man, he's followed the law from his youth. But this rich man can't quite bring himself to come to Jesus. So don't forget then that contrasting a rich man who fails in discipleship with a blind beggar who authenticates discipleship, Mark is making a very political social statement here. And that wasn't lost on the early church. There's a second century text called the Gospel of the Hebrews, and it talks about the rich man who comes to Jesus. And after Jesus says, sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and come and follow me, it says, but the rich man began to scratch his head, for it did not please him. And the Lord said to him, how can you say, I have fulfilled the law and the prophets, when it's written in the law, you shall love your neighbor as yourself? And lo, many of your brothers, sons of Abraham, are clothed in filth, dying of hunger. And your house is full of many good things, none of which goes out to them. So even in the second century, they were already interpreting the story of the rich man as being a criticism of those who have wealth and hoard it, as opposed to those who are ready to give freely in order to be made whole. Again, I think when we hold Bartimaeus in contrast with the rich man, we start to see an instance of the first becoming last, the last becoming first. Those of you who would be great must be servants of all. That paradox that's at the heart of Jesus' teaching. Okay, so that concludes the 10th chapter. There is one last thing I want to look at with you before we sign off for today, and it's something I've made reference to before over and over again. The story of Bartimaeus ends with the phrase that he followed Jesus on the way, or on the road. The word odo could be translated either way, okay? And I've said several times along the path of our study here that this is a very significant term in Mark's Gospel. And likewise, I said the term house, being in a house, is a significant location. And I kept promising that when we get to this story, we'd stop and look at all of those. So that's what we're going to do now. I want to just look at a number of times that Mark makes reference to being on the road or on the way, and then a number of references Mark makes to being in a house, and try to see the significance there. So the first thing I want you to do, though, is just to appreciate the sheer movement of this story. This isn't a story that takes place in a synagogue. And over again, week after week in the synagogue, marvelous things happen, and people come there from miles around, east and west, north and south, to gather at this synagogue. It's not located in a central place like that, like the temple would have been in Jerusalem. But instead, throughout these entire 10 chapters, Jesus has been going from here to there, hopping in a boat, going there, and then coming back here, and then going up over there, and then maybe over there, and back over here, and back home over here, and then circling around there, then back here, and now down here. I just drew you a map of all the wanderings of Jesus in his first 10 chapters. And so let's just appreciate the fact that this is a gospel on the move for these first 10 chapters. We are not in one single location. We're hardly ever in a large city. If Jericho is a large city, don't forget, we walked in and we walked out. That's it. But usually we're in small fishing villages or other small villages, or we're up in other people's territory, or we're in deserted places and we're coming back. So much time spent on the road. And it's significant because in the first chapter, we hear John the Baptizer, who's introduced as being like an Isaiah-like voice, or an Elijah-like voice, crying out from the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. So from the very, very beginning of this gospel, we know that what we're looking at is a preparation of the way, and that's John the Baptizer's role. He's preparing the way. Jesus is the way. Jesus is on the way. The road is very significant in the life of Jesus here. And then don't forget that when you have the first, second, and third disclosure, each of them is prefaced by a phrase that while they were on the way, Jesus asked the disciples, "Who are people saying that I am?" And after the second disclosure, the disciples are arguing, and Jesus asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" And there's a similar reference in the third disclosure that once that's done, then they go, and on the way, a rich man comes to Jesus, running to Jesus and asks him. So in the third disclosure, it says afterwards, they were on the way, and they were confused, they did not understand, and they were afraid to ask Jesus anything. So all three of the disclosures are related to being on the way. The rich man encounters Jesus on the way, and the contrast story of Bartimaeus happens as they're leaving Jerusalem and now Jericho, and now Bartimaeus will follow Jesus on the way. And in the very next story, I told you there were a couple of parallels here too. In the next story, they're going to enter into Jerusalem, and while they're on the way, on the road, people will begin shouting and throwing their cloaks onto the road and proclaiming the coming of the reign of David. So, in many ways, this story is closely related to the story that begins in chapter 11. And that's curious because a lot of Bible commentaries will say that this story of the healing of this blind man Bartimaeus is the end of the second major part of Mark's gospel, just like the first healing story of a blind man who couldn't see very well at first, saw people walking like trees, and then Jesus spat and rubbed his eyes, and then he saw again. It's kind of the end of the first major section in Mark's gospel. So, being on the way is very, very important. And, I have to say, one of my first trips ever to California was when I was it was my first trip ever to California. I was in a church college choir, and we were singing for about 5 weeks, traveling from Georgia to Northern California and back. And one of the places where we sang was Jack Hayford's church. It's a 4-square gospel church in Van Nuys called the Church on the Way. And that's a very smart name for a church, because being on the way is a reference to discipleship. Also in Mark's gospel, we have several references to a house and teachings that happen in a house. Quite often, Jesus will have an encounter with maybe the Pharisees or the scribes or the Sadducees or somebody, and in the open space. But then in the house, he'll explain to his disciples what's going on there. So we have several references to houses where Jesus seems to make location. And the first is Simon's house. This is in Capernaum. And after he calls the fishers, they end up going to Simon's house. They're there for a time. You remember crowds start to gather around. And then in the middle of the night, Jesus sneaks out. And the disciples find him. He says, "We've got to travel." So they go and travel. And when they're done, they end up back and they return to the house. Now, literally it says they return to a house, oikos. New Revised Standard Version reads that as they returned home, indicating that in their judgment, Jesus has made this now his home, as opposed to Nazareth, which was his childhood fatherland. After Jesus calls Levi, the tax collector, they have dinner in Levi's house, and that's where Jesus engages in arguments with the scribes. After Jesus goes up on the mountain in chapter 3, and he calls the 12 and anoints them as the apostles, after that it says he went to a house, or again, New Revised Version says he went home and was there teaching when his family from Nazareth came to fetch him because they thought he was crazy. And And then we have another reference to a house up in Tyre where Jesus is trying to get away, and this time he's in a house hiding, hoping that nobody knows who he is, and failing miserably at that because they know exactly who he is. One of the reasons why houses may factor in so prominently here, even more prominently than synagogues or other marketplace kind of gathering places, is because one of the arguments is that Mark could be writing to maybe house churches. I guess the most popular guess is somewhere in Rome, maybe not, but to those that aren't really locating their community in a synagogue or a temple or something like that, but rather to those Jewish, Gentile, early Christians who are gathering in homes. And as such, the home would make a very connection-worthy way of thinking about where teaching, instruction, and discipleship takes place. So, as you read Mark's Gospel, just notice the road, notice the homes. These are two of the most significant locations throughout the text. All right, that wraps up the last story in chapter 10. We'll get to the rest of the Gospel after the first of 2021. All of us are happy to see 2020 in the rearview mirror, I think. That would be lovely. And so join us on Wednesday night at 7 o'clock as we discuss this text together. Thanks. Bye.